Hi, everybody. It's the last lecture for History 126. Um, I wanted to say how much I enjoyed having you all in the class. I really, really, really liked this class. You all had a really special something, and so it makes me feel really bad that I kind of got bogged down in the logistics and got so confused at the end. Um, it's not an indication of what I think about you or this class, which I've loved this class more and more. The more I teach it, the more I like it. And so offering two sections of military history and the COVID crisis, and then coming into a world where every day seems like the previous day basically was probably a bridge too far, at least for me. And I'm getting up there. So I found a way to kind of unite both of the themes of the class, or at least the last month of class. So one, let me deal with the COVID first. I had said in class or last class that this is going to be in some ways the best of times and the worst of times, and you have seen in many ways America at its best. That the people have really stepped up to deal with social distancing much better than all the public health or the epidemiologists or the public health experts were anticipating. Um, Basically, everybody, almost everybody who can, is participating. So those rates is really what has driven down the spread of the disease. And for those of you who've been in the COVID-19 class, you see that, like, for instance, just a couple of days difference with California as compared to New York, where New York really covered themselves in infamy early on and then kind of got religion later on. But California did a really excellent job, and as a result, California is in really good shape. Washington State, even better than that. They got started earlier, took it much more aggressive steps. And then the states that are still, as we'd say in Missouri, kind of lollygagging and dawdling, like South Dakota, they're now dealing with outbreaks, and it's going to stress their hospital and healthcare systems because in rural areas, especially areas which have not expanded Medicaid, a lot of rural hospitals have been closed down, consolidated, and you're seeing that throughout the country. This gets into the worst of times. That even in Pennsylvania, there's a hospital system in I think it was in Easton. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the exact location, but they're owned by a private equity firm, and they basically extorted $8 million from the state treasury because they said basically, we're not making quite enough money, and so we're going to shut down, even with COVID-19 patients in hand, unless they get the money. And the governor coughed up the money, and then the taxpayer is going to be, which is you and me, is going to be paying all that. So it's money we're not going to have for other uses, like later in the year when we're laying people off. So the other parts of the worst of times is just how uneven the response has been, particularly from the federal government. It is really out. I think it's something that if you haven't lived through previous crises where the U.S., like like in Ebola or SARS or MERS, where the United States government took a lead and was able to mobilize resources and take a leadership role throughout the world as well as the United States, you can't appreciate how feckless and I guess lollygagging isn't quite the right word. I couldn't give you a worse word unless I start swearing, or a worse term. But it has been bad. We still have not recovered from the kind of testing fiasco. We still aren't on track to do that. And so you're starting to have states step up and play the role that the federal government would normally play. Um, the other parts of the kind of worst of things that we're seeing is, these are things that I've read that you haven't read, but like, for instance, we are still way short on N95 masks. And in 2000, and so this was something that was identified in previous administrations, I think even going back to the Bush administration, because what people realize is if you stockpile a few 100 million of these masks, they deteriorate over time. So some entrepreneurs came up with basically a system to manufacture the masks. And so you'd be able to have machinery that could make millions of masks in a day. And this has kind of went through the regulatory process and was being slow walked around. And then in 2018, was basically killed for lack of $20 million. So we could, we probably will get that up and running. But again, the kind of as Martin Luther King said, procrastination is a thief of time. You don't get that time back, and we don't get the lives back that we've lost. So the same with I heard a story this morning about the kind of why has the federal, even if the federal government wanted to kind of deploy its healthcare core, which it has a few thousand people that, like in the Ebola crisis, they were kind of they and sort of military assets or military personnel were flown into West Africa. It's not possible today because a lot of those people have other jobs, and one of the jobs is they work for the tribal health services or they work in the prison systems, and both of those places, just like everywhere else, and even more than everywhere else, is being slammed and kind of overwhelmed. And so this was a critical need to basically have a standing reserve army of a few thousand healthcare workers who would basically be able to step into a crisis like this and both track the disease, kind of limit the disease, or if we pass that point, which we have, to be able to go in and provide critical support in places where it's really needed. And that was a provision of the Affordable Care Act, which is, golly, I guess it is 10 years ago that happened. And then it's only in this latest round of the so-called stimulus bill has that money's been approved. So there's been just a kind of it kind of, as you know, I like the quote from Winston Churchill. He says, "You can count on Americans to do the right thing because they'll do every stupid wrong thing first." And so, and he said this in the context of World War II, and the U.S. showed up to that war a couple of years late, and the British had been standing alone against the Nazi and Japanese onslaught. So one of the things that I kind of gets us to our second point, which is the kind of the wartime theme. So we have seen the kind of rhetoric around that America is at war. And for those of you who have been going through or subjected to, might be a better term, subjected to the military history section, you know that I am fond of the kind of idea that what war is actually like is really different than our depictions of it, or the ways that it is sold to us or portrayed to us, either by movie makers, politicians, or even journalists, because we have a really, really strong preference to kind of tell the Disney side of the story, to Disneyfy it, to kind of tell ourselves as a kind of hero and to kind of downplay the real war parts of it. And so I think Paul Fussell's piece on the real war is just, I think is really interesting, really important, and it's also really relevant to COVID-19, because if this is a war, then it is not unlike the early stages of World War II, where the United States didn't put the right or the best weapons in the hands of our soldiers. So those, particularly the soldiers in the early stages of the war. In the later stages, there may not have been the best equipment available, particularly against the Germans, but at least there was a ton of it. Right now, we are short. We're seeing people in emergency rooms, and not just in the U.S., but it's more shocking, at least to me, as an old fart, as somebody who's thinking of America as the greatest country in the world. It's certainly the richest nation in the history of the world. To see people being asked to reuse 75-cent masks, to be scolded by the president for basically stealing the masks. That's why we need more masks. It's actually probably worse than World War II, where the soldiers didn't have particularly good equipment early in the war. There was at least a sense that we wanted to get them equipment, and we weren't screwing around on that. So you see both tremendous appreciation of healthcare workers, and again, they are put in a position where it's much is going to be asked of them. In fact, too much is going to be asked of them, and they aren't given the tools needed to really do well. And so this is again a kind of question of politics and public policy that we dithered and kind of nickel and dimed ourselves so that now we, for the lack of a horseshoe nail, we are basically for the not kind of dealing with a pandemic workforce, for not or task force, for not having a kind of the machinery to build the N95 masks, to not basically have these strategic reserves ready, to not deal with all of that stuff. We are really going to be costing trillions of dollars, and we saved at most a few $billions. And again, this was something that, if you know anything about the history of, even if you want to ignore the history of pandemics, which I think is a mistake, think about it. If what we were dealing with now was not a particularly nasty virus, but a bioweapon, and we had been attacked and millions of people exposed simultaneously to some really nasty Soviet era virus or something else like that, or even just something that the boys in Al Qaeda bought off the shelf from the Pakistanis or the North Koreans, we would be completely FUBAR. And so there is a kind of enduring theme that we like to think that what war is something that makes us greater than we are, it plays into our tribalistic notions, but what we think war is just not what it is. And so we're in a war, and we're dealing with the kind of problems that Americans have dealt with before in wars. And so in some ways, I think we're dealing with worse problems than we've dealt with in previous wars. And so all of our tribal partisanship really comes to the fore in a way that is particularly unuseful for this time. So again, we're going to get through it, we're going to survive it, but if you think that this is the last crisis like this, either in the last pandemic you'll face, that would probably not be the case. And as you know, as I've made reference to, the crisis of global climate change is not just coming, it's come, but it's going to get more and more expensive and problematic. It's going to interrupt our it's going to have a huge economic impact, and it's already seen that in places like Norfolk, Virginia, where it's starting to flood. It's going to play havoc with our water, with our food systems. You saw that last year in the Midwest. And so it's, we need to kind of rethink a number of things. And if you want to think about war, we need kind of resiliency and the ability to kind of really come together. So I hope, I live in I alternate between kind of cynicism and pessimism about the human condition and then wild flights of fancy. I do hope that we get things together and that we are the angels of our nature, the better angels of our nature, come forward, as Lincoln would have talked about, and we basically start to focus not on what's the way things should happen or the way we'd like to see reality be, but basically just try to make the world a better, more livable place and work within the imperfect, messy world that is American politics and what actually succeeds. So I've talked for a long time, and I appreciate you putting up with me for all this semester. And again, I really, really enjoyed having you in class. If you ever get a chance to take another class with me, it won't be next year, but maybe in a couple of years, we'll see each other again. I wish you all the very best. I hope you have a great time this summer and then in the fall at LVC, or for those of you who are graduating, that you have a great rest of your life. I really believe that history is a discipline that can lay a groundwork that you can use and to understand the world, both to understand your own history, to kind of challenge yourself, to kind of think about the ways things actually were as opposed to the way you kind of imagined them to be, and just something that is one of many things that you can enjoy and appreciate and use to kind of help solve problems as we confront them together in our world. So very much wishing you all the best. Thank you.